right, we are going to go ahead and lead into our next speaker, and her name is Savannah Alshove. I am sure I am butchering your name, Savannah. I am so sorry. So just to quickly get into your bio, in 2018, Savannah obtained her BA in Writing Studies from Eastern Mennonite University, and then in 2019, finished her master's at the Mitchell Institute at Queens, where she focused her studies on the use of diaries and expressive writing as a tool to heal trauma. She currently lives in Virginia, awaiting to begin her PhD studies. And here is Savannah with Conflict, Crisis, and Resolution, the use of diaries as a tool for peace. Thank you, Savannah.
Thank you, Carly. Let me figure out how to share my screen. Alrighty. So, hi everyone. I am Savannah Olsheve, which that was a very close pronunciation. That's what most people say. And I'm going to just jump right in and start us off with reading an excerpt from a diary. This is Student C, Kidnapped. One day in 2018, I got a call from my younger brother. That day was an awful day. I got the notice that one of my brothers was kidnapped. That notice broke my feelings in pieces. I had a lump in my heart when my brother said that. It is hateful when somebody that you do not know can take control on your feelings. For example, I had to think 24 hours a day about him. All my memories came through my mind when we were children, and now I lost him only because someone wanted money to let him alive. After we collected the money to give to that people, it took 1 week to get information about my brother. But the blessed word that I heard was when I heard my brother's voice. This is an excerpt from one of my students at a writing workshop that I taught at the Intensive English program in Harrisonburg, Virginia. My students came from all over the world: Guatemala, Colombia, Mexico, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea. They range between the ages of 21 and 45. However, they all shared the same thing: terrible experiences of violence. For my research, I primarily looked at 3 diaries: the diary of Anne Frank, Zlata's diary, and the Freedom Writer's diary, as well as the diary workshop exercises from my students. The Freedom Writers, for those of you who don't know, were a class of kids from Southern California who overcame trauma from violence in their community by reading about famous diarists such as Anne Frank and writing their own diaries. When interviewing one of the writers, Tony Becerra, he said that writing in his diary helped him heal from the violence that he saw in his community every day as a child. He also said that having a personal diary published not only helped him identify the problems in his life, but he also saw that his stories could help others experiencing similar things and see that they too could overcome their experience of violence. Expressive writing as a tool for overcoming experiences of violence and trauma has been used for years. It can be seen in genocide survivors' memoirs, in soldiers' diaries, and in some classrooms around the world. However, it has only recently been recognized by psychologists as an effective cognitive method for treating trauma, and therefore has rarely been studied outside of psychology labs. Furthermore, to my current knowledge, very little research has been done on how the use of expressive writing, particularly through the form of diary writing, can be used in post-conflict zones as a peace-building tool to help stop the continuation of violence and also transgenerational trauma. So today, we're going to look at how sharing accounts of trauma helps people to better understand their own narratives. Also, how using diary writing, such as the FEW method, can help someone express and identify their trauma, which leads me to my main point, that if people can heal from their trauma from these 2 ways, they are less likely to pass it on to others and continue a cycle of violence in small communities. So the FEW method, or the intensive journal method, was first introduced by Ira Progroff in 1974. This led the way for the focused expressive writing, or FEW, which is the acronym that I use. The FEW method is a method of writing about a traumatic experience with as much detail as possible. And it requires the writer to rewrite the experience multiple times. So in psychology labs, normally they would take students or patients who had been suffering from traumatic experiences or had experienced a ton of violence, and they would sit them down in a controlled room and would just rewrite this experience over and over and over. And so the idea behind using the FEW method is to treat trauma is that when a person is traumatized, they lose access to a certain part of the brain, which results in the victim to lose language accessibility to be able to disclose their trauma. So FEW is an effective way of regaining that language and also safely disclosing the issue through writing, as some people have a hard time speaking about it. One of the key psychologists in expressive writing, James Pennebaker, states that there are 3 key positive effects to writing about trauma. 1 is long-term cognitive and emotional. 2 is social. 3 is biological. And a general consensus amongst psychologists is that expressive writing can help victims of trauma in 2 ways. The first is through creating a new understanding of violence in the world that they live in. And the second is to disclose the pain that cannot be spoken. I also chose to use some of John Paul Lederach's theories on the moral imagination as a framework for my research. Lederach believes that peace building must be like art. It must capture the human experience of those who are victims. It should portray the complexities of their lives in the simplest form to help communicate their needs on a greater level and to attain peace. Diaries not only capture human experience in their simplest form, but they are also a gateway into which communities and NGOs can break down the greater complexity of the causes of violence which are plaguing a particular place. So, how can sharing accounts of trauma help people better understand their own narratives? Well, I think a prime example can be seen in the diary of Anne Frank. On the 12th of June, 1942, a girl called Anne wrote in her diary that she was given for her birthday. She said, "I hope I will be able to confide everything to you, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you will be a great source of comfort and support." Little did Frank know that in a few months' time, this diary would become her only friend and confidant, and would not only serve as a witness to the Holocaust, but would also set precedents for all diaries and personal accounts written in violent times. While Anne was not able to see the effect that her diary had on the world, like the other diarists that I have studied, her legacy lives on through every young writer who gives witness to atrocity and violence. Her words haunted Zlata Filippovic as she wrote her diary during the Bosnian War, and they inspired the 150 students that make up the Freedom Writers to have strength and courage in their times of distress and oppression. Frank's diary is a perfect example of how sharing a personal account of violence can spread to make international change and awareness. And her words have touched the most paramount diarist of the past 3 decades. Anne Frank's diary is unique in that it has been so massively widespread that many other societies have been able to use the book as a workshop. The Anne Frank Translation Project in Cambodia used her diary to show Cambodians that they were not alone in their own experience of genocide and that others have faced similar experiences. The Freedom Writers, the other diary, also relied heavily on the use of Anne's diary as a tool for understanding violence in the classroom, and part of their teachers' tactic were to read diaries and books that had meaning for the students. In Southern California during the 1990s, there was a lot of terrible gang violence, and Erin Gruwall, a high school teacher in the area, thought that by having her students keep their own diaries and reading books, such as the Diary of Anne Frank, that perhaps they could overcome the violence that they saw in their daily lives as well. She was right. Personal accounts touch lives. The small details in a diary is something that everyone can connect to. However, some scholars believe that the use of diaries such as Zlata Filippovic's is harmful because it universalizes and westernizes suffering. And while not all violence is the same, I beg to say that it is universal in a sense. Every person on this planet has the same emotions: loss, anger, sadness, happiness, love, which is why the use of diaries as a tool for advocacy to help someone relate to another person is effective. Diaries aren't political, they aren't propaganda. It's a look into someone's experience of life. The proliferation of diaries such as Anne's, Zlata's, and the Freedom Writers has had a life-changing impact on individuals across cultural, national, and religious divides. An example can be seen in Diary 36 of the Freedom Writers. And just to preface, all diaries in the Freedom Writers are anonymous. They're just labeled by the number entry. So in Diary 36, the author writes, "At the end of the book, I was so mad that Anne died, because as she was dying, a part of me was dying with her. I cried when she cried. And just like her, I wanted to know why the Germans were killing her people. Just like her, I knew the feeling of discrimination and to be looked down upon based on the way you look. Just like her, I sometimes feel like a bird in a cage and I just want to fly away." The first thing that came to my mind when I finished reading the book was the fact that Miss G was right. I did find myself within the pages of the book, like she said I would. None of the Freedom Writers ever experienced the Holocaust. Neither did any of them experience what it is like to live in a city being bombed 24 hours of the day. However, they could still find similarities in Anne's and Zlata's stories, and they could still relate to their suffering. Furthermore, not only did the students find that they could share their suffering by reading the diary of Frank and Filpovic, but they also found that reading their narratives gave them a sense of empowerment and community. An example of empowerment can be seen in Diary 39, where the author discusses how reading a personal account from women in Bosnia who were sexually attacked revived the lost memory within her mind of being molested as a child. The author states that while reading the accounts brought back the traumatic memory, it also made her feel a sense of community, that she was not alone in her suffering. And furthermore, it made her want to share her story with others and do something to help other women and girls who were sexually attacked. In Diary 41, the author talks about how the Gestapo reminded him of the gangs that controlled his neighborhood. And in Diary 37, the writer discusses how they felt that the abuse she and her mother took from her mother's boyfriend, James, was comparable to the abuse suffered by those in concentration camps. The author writes, "I've read about the monstrous things that were done in concentration camps in World War II. I've read about how they would torture, starve, and mutilate people's bodies into something that was not recognizable as a human being. I watched my mother being beaten half to death by James, and I watched as blood and tears streamed down her face, which was also unrecognizable. I felt useless and scared and furious at the same time, knowing that I could do nothing to help her. I can relate to Anne and Zlata. Like them, I have a diary. I write about how it feels to have disgust and hatred centered directly on you because of who you are." So, how can diary writing help someone express and identify their trauma? One of the really interesting aspects of this research was that I was able to interview Zlata Filpovic of Zlata's diary and two of the Freedom Writers about their experiences with writing as a tool for overcoming trauma and violence. All three of the writers found that being able to talk and share their writing with other people helped them overcome social boundaries. Tony Becerra of the Freedom Writers told me, quote, "One of the reasons we started writing it was because we thought that nobody else was going through what we were going through. We thought we were going through it alone. When we started writing stories, we realized that we were all going through it together. And I think these themes are universal to all young people. No matter how much time goes by, I feel like the message is pretty universal. The farther we go around the world or around the country, the larger the impact it has on people. We go farther away and people can still see that somebody halfway across the world is going through the same thing that they're going through, and it kind of humanizes the world." Sue Ellen Apatizar, also of the Freedom Writers, told me of her experience of sharing her diary with the world. And she states, quote, "I was petrified because it's exposing part of yourself that's really vulnerable. It's a lot of the time not the best situations that we're talking about, but writing my story, it was the act of writing, which was a cathartic experience for me, to being able to put it on a piece of paper, to see it, and to not just be jumbled inside of me, but also knowing the fact that someone else who may have found themselves in a similar situation was going to be able to read that, was going to be able to relate to that. That's the part that makes it worth it. I find it empowering because it's empowering for others. So in my personal research, I did a workshop at the intensive English program. I myself am not a professionally trained second language teacher, but they were gracious enough to let me come into their school and do a workshop with some of their students that they knew came from kind of violent countries and had experienced a form of violence. And a lot of the students as well, their status in the United States was undetermined. Most people suspected that a lot of the students were illegal in the country or were here on refugee status. So in my workshops, I not only wanted to help my students accurately address the violence that they had faced, but also, since I was trying to do the work of a second language teacher, I needed to be able to do this in a way that helped them have more control over a second language. Each class, change the slide. Each class would include a close reading of the diary being workshopped that week. We looked at all 3 of the diaries previously discussed, followed by a practical lesson in writing, such as descriptive writing or point of view writing. And then finally, there would be hands-on writing using the FEW method, as well as other fun writing exercises to ease any tension. Since the FEW method calls for rewriting the same issue over and over, I thought it would be more useful if the students learned how to write about their experiences in multiple different ways and a bit more creatively, just so they weren't just rewriting the same words hundreds of times. And I thought that by doing it and by having them think about the way they were writing, that perhaps it would also help them think of new ways of how they understand their own narrative and their identity after experiencing the trauma. So the first session, I asked them to write their experience plainly. The second time, I asked them to describe in detail what they saw, smelled, tasted, and felt in the moment. And the third time, I asked them to write their experience from a detached perspective. I really think by having students delve into the language and think about their experiences in different ways, it can help them better understand and grasp the violence or trauma that they have witnessed. And I had not found any studies of anyone who had done this way, but I also didn't find any studies that said that by mediating the FEW method in this way would be harmful or wouldn't work. So at the end of the class, I also conducted a self-survey for the students during the last class. The students had the choice to decline commenting on some of the questions, or if they didn't want to comment on any. And they also had the choice to take the survey anonymously if they wished. However, they all decided to take it unanonymously. The first question asked which diary the students related to most, if at all. And the majority said the diary of Anne Frank, which was surprising because only one of my students out of 6 had ever heard of the diary of Anne Frank before. And Zlata's diary came in second. Student B said that he related to Zlata's diary because, quote, "I know people who live in fear in this country too." When the students were asked if they believed if their writing could be used for change in their home countries, 4 out of 6 said that they believed this was possible. All of the students said they felt empathy for all of the writers. The students also stated that they were impressed that the writers were able to describe such violent situations without using profanity. And student F stated that, quote, "Each one of them have a hard time, but they have hope too. So I learned from them to always have hope, because if we don't have hope, our life is going to be much harder than it is." And finally, at the end of the survey, the students were asked if they found any level of the writing process to be therapeutic and helpful to them when looking back on their past trauma. 3 students stated that they felt better thinking back upon the past, and it helped them put the past into perspective. Student A said, quote, "Writing every week was healing." While 1 student did not comment on this question, and the other 2 said it was helpful, but not necessarily therapeutic. So the great thing about the FEW method as a peace building tool is that it's free. You don't need thousands of dollars to put the FEW method into practice in a post-conflict society. And diary writing in particular can be used as a way to help thousands of people deal with their trauma across the world if mediated correctly. It can be used as a practice for soldiers returning from war, for survivors of sexual assault, and for communities in post-conflict areas. And I would just like to conclude a talk with a quote from, I'm almost done, quote from Eli Wiesel from his post-Holocaust memoir that I think perfectly sums up the impact that writing about trauma can have. He said, "Did I write it so as not to go mad, or on the contrary, to go mad in order to understand the nature of madness, the immense, terrifying madness that had erupted in history in the conscience of mankind? Was it to leave behind a legacy of words, of memories, to help prevent history from repeating itself? Or was it simply to preserve a record of the ordeal that I endured as an adolescent at an age when one's knowledge of death and evil should be limited to what one discovers in literature?" Thank you.
Thank you so much, Savannah. That was so interesting. And we have a handful of questions for you. First question says here, do you think that the translations of diaries pose ethical risks? While the diaries themselves might not be political and serve to document personal experience, the translators of such documents may have their own political agendas, particularly in times of conflict.
Oh, yes, definitely. And I saw that in my research, I did see this was an issue. One interesting, I guess, circumstance that this happened in was the diary of Anne Frank in North Korea. At one point, I don't remember the time period, maybe this is still how it is. It was translated and taught in North Korean schools as kind of like a way for North Koreans to view like the United States as the new Nazi Germany. And I guess the way they taught it in class was that North Koreans were like the Jews and the United States was like Nazi Germany, which was very interesting. And I didn't think of that before. And there have been other circumstances of diaries being mistranslated as well.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Next question here says, I'm wondering which one is more powerful, the writing of the diary or the sharing of it with others?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold, and that's my personal thoughts. There's usually 2 schools of thoughts in diary writing in psychology and I guess in international advocacy. Some people say that writing the diary is the cathartic experience, and there is scientific background to prove that by writing about traumatic experiences, it can help you identify the trauma that you're experiencing, disclose it, and deal with it so you're not reliving that moment in your head forever. But then also sharing it, I guess there really isn't any scientific proof on this yet, but sharing it, as many of the authors that I've interviewed and what I found for my students has also been empowering to them because they felt more of a sense of community in times when they felt alone. So I personally believe that both those 2 aspects combined is what really makes diary writing and I guess personal account sharing a good tool for, overcoming violence.
Yeah, that makes sense. Next question we have here says, in using the diary as an exercise for exploring their trauma, is there a potential problem in that they may write with a particular audience in mind, and therefore it's not their most innermost thoughts as a diary written for just oneself?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. I mean, I guess there's no way you can really figure that out. But I do believe that, through my work and through what the Freedom Writers did, because they did a very similar thing in their classroom, I think you are going to have some people who do write for a particular audience. And I think you will have some people who actually find it a valuable exercise as well. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. And it's also something I kept in mind during this research too.
Right. I think without directly asking the participants if they had someone in mind that they were writing for audience-wise, you just don't know what that audience intention was or what their intention with writing is.
Yeah, exactly.
We have one more question for you in our chat. It says, can you explain more about the critique that diaries can universalize suffering?
Yeah, so there's one particular author. I didn't know if it was professional to actually call out academic writers in a conference, so I didn't, who has written a few articles, journals about how personal accounts, and in particular Zalata's diary and the diary of Anne Frank, has universalized the idea of suffering, the idea of genocide and of trauma. And he does have some really good points. Like if you notice I guess the problem with Zalata's that he said was that they brought Zalata to the UN a lot, and the UN liked having her come on to talk about her diary and about what happened to her because she came from a particular community in Bosnia. And so the critique behind that is that I guess international agencies can have an agenda by who they choose to put forward, whose stories they put out there, which is very true. But also a lot of other people who came from different backgrounds and different nationalities and countries and demographics still found a lot of camaraderie in hearing Zalata's stories. So even if the UN or whatever institution is putting out these diaries does have an agenda, I think suffering in itself is still kind of universal, so it doesn't really matter in that way. Not that it doesn't matter that they have an agenda, but that there's still some good can come out of it.
Right. Well, Savannah, thank you so much for this presentation. It was so fascinating. Really appreciated this talk today.